In the beginning, there were slides. There was nothing. In the beginning, there was a void. So this is going to be quick, and it's going to be hopefully to the point. The title of the book is Disability and Spirituality, Recovering Wholeness, and this is an attempt to sort of give you a bit about the hypothesis of this. As you all know, the models of disability that have been floating around for a while that you work within in the wider secular world have been the medical model, which many people have been working against, and then the social model that then says that disability is not so much an impairment as it is a condition imposed by environment, attitude, context, thoughts, beliefs about disability. There's so many, as you've heard the kinds of sayings, it's your attitude is my biggest disability, not what's wrong with me or what the physical condition I have are. But neither one of those in the history of those discussions about those models have included spirituality and faith in any significant way. In the medical model, which was operative when I first got into the field, I was challenged as a young CPE intern to be part of a medical model interdisciplinary team at a university center, which had no place at the table for pastoral care, and nobody had ever thought about talking really to pastoral care and talking with families and individuals. And so that became the challenge of how to get a place at that interdisciplinary table. In the social model of disability, there's some work done on religion and disability, but so often and way too often, it reflects what people would consider the harm or the danger that religion or spirituality has posed to people with disabilities because of the kinds of attitudes or the pronouncements made about whose fault a disability is or what people could do to change it. So what's happened is a kind of fracturing of the world, and many of us have worked, and I've worked for 45 years, in which two worlds sometimes seem to be fractured and apart from one another. One, kind of the world of spirituality on the one hand, and the other, the world of disability on the other. But people with disabilities and their families live in their own world, in a world where it's different from the world of faith and communities and the world of systems and knowledge in other ways. One of my favorite quotes for 30 years has been Ellen Cook, a Roman Catholic mom, who said, as you can see, parenting a disabled child forces us to live one day at a time. It places a family in the middle of a measured scientific, educational, medical world. Measured, assumption to be measured and orderly, with all the chaos that real life has to offer, So is it at time? Part of the appeal for me, and what many of us have been doing, you as well, has been trying to bridge the breach, to the tikkun olam, to bring those worlds together, to repair the gap, to cross the gap. And my basic premise in the book, and today, we won't get into it a lot, is if one starts off trying really to understand disability, you inevitably end up in the world of spirituality. And then second, if you start trying to understand spirituality, you inevitably end up in the world of disability. So how come if you start from one direction and you end up in the other, and vice versa, how come they're not all together at the very beginning? And how can we envision that? So why the breach that's happened in some of this time? Because of the different models. One is science and religion with different ways of knowing and suspicions of each other and around the different ways of knowing. Also because of bad religion and bad science. As many people with disabilities will know, and you will know, you've had experiences where you know how religion has not been helpful to people with disabilities or their families, and the experiences or the attitudes or the stereotypes that come from that. But there are also been a lot of bad science. Eugenics was bad science. Patterning was bad science. Some of the really hard parts about applied behavioral analysis and behavior modification is science that may be somewhat effective, but it's also manipulating people in a whole variety of ways. I mean, science has also led to things that have not been good for people. And also the new sciences and the new kind of melding a bit of the medical and the social sciences model still doesn't deal with the depths of meaning and connection, and connection meaning relationships and sense of purpose, and the purpose of both life and the purpose of meaning, and how do I define my life. Those new sciences don't deal with those depths of what people feel and believe in terms of the meaning of all this for my life and for others. The World Health Organization had a model of disability that came out in around 1980 that I used for a long time, thought it was terrific. It really helped me to think about some things that instead of seeing a disability as a disorder or disease which led to an impairment, some functional loss, which then led to a lack of ability to do something that was usually typical for most people, and then in 1980, our attitude about that disability or impairment was the handicap. So it separated out the disability, not being able to do something, with the attitude about it, which was the real handicap and what people had mostly had to struggle with. They got accused, and rightly so, of think about this as not necessarily a 1, 2, 3, 4 progression in terms of way things develop, and so they came out with a new model that is much more dynamic, which, if you look at this to say disability involves a health condition which impacts activity. It also goes over, it impacts body functions or structure. It also may impact participation. The body functions, participation, activity are impacted with each other, and all of those are also impacted and impact environmental factors around people, architecturally, attitudinally, socially, legally, the social world in which people live, and personal factors, i.e., what do I think about my own disability? What's my attitude towards disability? What's my personal context, my personal story that I bring to that? And the power of this model for me is that it talks about, this is really about the interrelationship of all those factors that go into what a disability actually means. And in the World Health Organization, the key thing these days, and often, is this question of participation. That one of the biggest disabilities and one of the biggest issues about is how does any of this impact anything that limits people's participation in life as others might usually expect to participate, is the key kind of issue related to disability. So how would you define spirituality? We all have our different definitions about spirituality, but let me use one from Dr. Christina Puchowski. Spirituality is the dimension of a person that seeks to find meaning in his or her life. It's also the quality that supports connection and relationship to the sacred, as well as with each other. In the book, and you've heard me do things for a long time, and I've written about the ways that I've worked on this using the values of our disability services in a Western perspective, that almost any agency or service organization or legal framework cites the values of independence, productivity, inclusion, and self-determination, and cultural competence, kind of as the 4 or 5 key values. Every one of those values in this culture, in Western culture, is a way of trying to answer a spiritual question or existential question of independence is who am I? In America, the Western world, we are to be independent, draw ourselves up by the bootstraps, go west, young man, and become a person's core value. And what that means is who am I? What are your core values? Your core meaning, your core sense of identity. What is most sacred to you? What makes you you? And what you is the heart of who you are. We answer the why am I question in our society by how productive are you? What do you do? It's the second question we usually ask each other. But productivity, the why am I, has much more to do with than employment, but also has to do with sense of calling and purpose, obligation, contribution to the society and to other people's lives. And then third, whose am I? The question, that's my wife, the biblical scholar, says that's the real biblical question. It's not who are you, but whose are you? Who do you belong to? Who are you connected to? In the South, we say, who are your people? Who are the communities that you're part of? And then self-determination is more kind of what kind of power do I have over my life and control do I have over my life? And the cultural competence area has to do with, well, will my unique story or my cultural story be respected? And you can't be culturally competent and ignore people's spiritual and religious backgrounds, the culture in which those swim. So what's the promise of kind of bringing those two back into function and back into unity a bit? There are state-of-the-art research strategies to explore the importance of spirituality for individuals with disabilities and their families. Eric Carter is the master behind this and is the one who's been leading a lot of this. There's secondly, and all of you are part of this, an explosion of theological inquiry into disability through multiple theological disciplines. And third, more and more community-based providers are trying to ask questions that honor and look at spiritual needs and supports, recognizing spirituality as a untapped dimension, unexplored dimension of people's lives, and as a pathway really to community connection. Eric's book, but there's also a lot of people beginning to do this in serious ways. The collaborative efforts to address spiritual supports that can be done together between faith groups, service providers, advocacy groups, and individuals and families. And pardon this PowerPoint, I thought I'd corrected it. One of my articles looks at the challenge and power of pastoral counseling kind of over the lifespan. You can think about this from a lifespan perspective at all the periods of people's lives, but also from multiple arenas of people's lives: work, employment, families, individuals, friendships, and other kinds of parts of people's lives and working together. What's the challenge for community clergy, all of those who are in faith communities, is to recognize, one, that you and we are the largest single resource for social capital and natural supports, in fact, potential. You are the largest, it's stated in a secular framework, but you are the largest single potential resource and real resource in terms of social capital for people with disabilities and their families in the country. Recognize that faith, especially related to intellectual disabilities, does not equate with reason, and look at that seriously. Recognize that as we become more inclusive and welcoming, we're going to have to deal with the healing of memories in the lives of people with disabilities and their families who have been burned and hurt in the past, and to be able to receive that anger and that hurt in ways that hears it deeply, to move past an interpretation of disability that only looks at it through a lens of poverty or suffering, although to relook at it, disability and poverty, because too often to be disabled means you're poor in this country and around the world, and to move past looking at disability through the theistic question of why. Get over it, get past that, because that's not the issue for most people with disabilities. I think what we have done is confuse the why question of the disability with the why question of what's the purpose in my life. And that's the why question we want to help people deal with, not the why of the disability. And we in faith communities too often get hung up on the why of the disability and stay there. For professionals in the world of services and supports, it means reinterpreting professional, means recognizing spirituality, means not saying we're value-free, but value-clear, being very clear about our values, being honest, more honest about the mutuality of relationships between provider and receiver, consumer, professional. There's a mutuality of relationships there from the very beginning. And to look at kind of what it means to be a professional, to vows of loyalty and steadfastness and commitment to others that were part of the professing orders long ago. The only vow that most professionals would not take these days is of poverty and chastity, but we could perhaps pledge and vow to give up some of our power and share the power more equally in terms of mutuality. So this is an Eric Carter slide as we think about how these worlds intersect with individuals with disabilities, with families, faith communities, and service systems. I'd like to propose a little bit of a different model that looks like this, with spirituality at the heart, of individuals and families surrounded by faith communities and surrounded by communities and service systems, so that these are not separate worlds trying as a Venn diagram to get closer together, but are seen with one kind of unique and whole vision with spirituality at the very heart of it. And so for both worlds, it becomes a uniting center where the values of human life and the importance of lifelong support as needed or desired is present, to enable people with disabilities to live lives not solely defined by deficit or impairment, but by strengths and gifts and passion, and lives full of purpose and contribution, and lives closely connected to friends, communities, and their preferred faith or spiritual traditions. In other words, whole lives and whole communities. Thank you.